and welcome to the Women's Show. I'm Lenina Rassool. The Western Cape government is appointing South Africa's first child commissioner. This is an iconic moment, as this process has been in operation for a few years now. Last year in October, the Standing Committee for Social Development released 59 nominees for public comment and now has released 15 shortlisted candidates, with interviews taking place between the 17th and the 19th of February. After that, we'll have our first child commissioner. Tonight we have two representatives from the child protection sector, as well as the chairperson of the Standing Committee for Social Development, to unpack what this role will entail, what this person will do, and how it will contribute to the well-being and safety of our children. But before that, let's have a look at what's happened so far and what the process will look like for the appointment of the first Western Cape Child Commissioner.
In March 2019, the Western Cape Child Commissioner for Children Act was signed into law, and almost 1 year later, South Africa is on the verge of appointing its first child commissioner. While the appointment will be on a provincial level, the position is a first for the country, and the process will serve as an example for further appointments in the future. The position will allow for a children's commissioner to protect and promote the interests of children in the province, monitor, investigate, research and lobby on issues and policy that have an impact on children, uphold the rights of children, and ensure that crime and its impact on children and child safety are addressed. On the 9th of October 2019, the names of 54 candidates were published for public notice, and 2 weeks were given for public objections. In December 2019, a shortlist of 15 candidates were released, with interviews to take place on the 17th to the 19th of February 2020. This appointment is a momentous one, particularly for its mandate to hold other government departments who deal with children's rights accountable. To see the shortlist of 15 candidates, go to wcpp.gov.za.
Welcome back. You're watching The Women's Show, and tonight we are speaking about the new Western Cape Child Commissioner that will be appointed. And joining us in studio is Gillion, who is the chairperson for the Standing Committee on Social Development, Valdi Van Reenan, who is the former director of the Trauma Center and now director of the Violence Prevention Agency, and Patric Solomons, who's the director of Molo Songololo. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you. Nice to be here with you again.
Good to have you. Gillion, I'm going to start with you. The Western Cape is appointing a child commissioner. And before we go into sort of unpacking that process, I wanted to find out what led to the appointment or the decision to appoint a child commissioner for the Western Cape, and what gaps are we hoping to sort of fill with this position?
So the position of the Commissioner for Children for the Western Cape has been on the provincial statutes in the provincial constitution for the last 10, 15 years. And it's a position that was created in the constitution as an additional layer to protect the rights of children in this province. In the 5th Parliament, public participation process started where that position had to be given a legislative framework. And the Western Cape Commissioner for Children's Act was then developed. As part of that act, it prescribed that in the 6th Parliament, we had to appoint a Commissioner for Children. So that's how we've gotten to this point. And just in terms of the gaps, as we know, South Africa has become quite a violent place, and a particularly violent place for children and for vulnerable young people. And in this province, we've seen a spike in violent crime, and violent crime specifically aimed at vulnerable children. And what I think this piece of legislation provides through the role of the Commissioner is for an additional layer of protection to look at how do we survey the legislation that's available to protect children, and also how do we investigate some of the shortcomings and the issues where children are involved, specifically when it comes to service delivery and the role of government.
So, okay, Patric and Valdi, and you can decide who's going to go first. I want to just get into sort of those gaps. Now I know that there was an initial call for a commission of inquiry into sort of child protection or child safety, and that didn't happen. And the next we heard, and by we I mean sort of from a public perspective, was that the appointment for the Western Cape Child Commissioner is moving forward. So I just wanted to find out what were some of the things that came up, or some of the gaps really, or things that needed to be done that came up within the the People's Commission.
Historical background is very, very important, because I think that's will also give us a sense of how to understand what we're dealing with now. Now, when the Western Cape Constitution came into being, there was in 1997 or somewhere around there. There was a provision, as Gillion said, for the province, the Parliament and the Premier to establish a Commissioner for Children. So, so that is like 20 years ago, right? Right. So throughout that period, the politicians did not want to set this up, but it was civil society organizations who has been putting pressure on them. Then in 2013, there was a proposal to change the constitution to reduce the obligation to set up the commissioner, and that was then also fought by civil society organizations. So where we now is not because the politicians got a green light and they had, no, it was because of the pressure of civil society organizations. And then the law was then established, came into effect last year, beginning of last year. And I think it's a very historical process, because the idea of a commissioner for children is not a new idea, right? There are many countries who have established commissioners for children, and it's being seen as part of the child rights framework. So it's a very important component of promoting children's rights, of protecting children's rights, and then also to report on children's rights. So that is why it's important. So what we see in the Western Cape now with this new law is quite unique and quite historic. But on a national level, we also have provisions with the first draft of the Children's Act, for example. There was provisions for a children's protector. But of course, the politicians took it out. And at the moment, this week in itself, the Human Rights Commission will be sitting to look at the idea of a more viable, full-time, independent commissioner for children on a national level. So there's those kind of developments that's happening there as well. So South Africa is lagging behind when it comes to establishing commissions for children. Hopefully we're going to catch up very quickly and very soon. And so that is part of the historical background that we need to know and understand. There's a lot of misunderstandings about the role and function of a commissioner, or even the role and function of the initiative to have a commission of inquiry, right? And I think there was a lot of conversation between the politicians and the civil society organizers in terms of why is it important, for example, the commission of inquiry, and I think Valdi can sort of talk to that. So, and I think we still need to do a lot of education in terms of what is the role and function of the commissioner. We've got the guideline for, in terms of the Act at the moment, but I think that guideline also needs to be interrogated in terms of what exactly does it mean, right? And what are the limitations of the Act, for example? Because the commissioner, according to the Act, is supposed to be an independent person with an independent office that being set up to monitor children and to children's rights, how the government is doing to implement children's rights, for example. And then, of course, also to hear complaints and then to investigate, right? And then, of course, to report to Parliament. So the Commissioner will be accountable to Parliament. So those things are very important. So, and I think we need to do a lot of education about that in itself. It is a new position being set up now, and I think we need to see in terms of what are we going to do to make sure that we find the right possible person to start this process, because it's going to go down in history. And I think the issue with for example, the Commission of Inquiry and where we are now is also about there's a need for understanding about what it is that we need to do. Because government have to play their role, civil society have to play their role, Parliament has got to play their role, and everybody has got different roles and functions to play. But I think when, if Valdi just reflect, for example, the concerns that politicians raise around the Commission for Inquiry, we hear some of the similar concerns now with the Commissioner for Children.
Well, Valdi, could you possibly expand on that?
Yeah. You know, I think we must begin to contextualize why a child commissioner, why a People's Commission of Inquiry. And at the end of the day, it was because children were being violated, their rights were being violated. And so in this whole process, we forget that this is not simply about parliamentary processes, it's not simply about legislation, it's about children. We exclude them, in fact, in a way, from going through the entire process. But be that as it may, I think after many, many years, you know, it was under former Premier Rassool that we had the draft bill, and then it was delayed, and 2008 when the former Premier Zille came in, that is when she promised that it would be taken up again. And here we are, almost a decade later, and still not finalized, and still very controversial. And we reached a point where, as the trauma center, when I was still director there, we reached a point where we were becoming very tired of having to collect statistics on murdered children. And we asked ourselves, how many more children will die? And what will we do with this list? What is the purpose of it? And that is when we jumped into advocacy. We had written to the Premier and we asked, can we meet on a commission of inquiry? And right from the start, the former Premier Zille was very clear that commissions of inquiry are expensive, that we don't have the money for it, and this was just not a priority. And after a long process of back and forth and lies and calling of reports that was done, that was never actually done, we reached a point where we said, well, if you're not prepared to do a commission, we'll do it. And you know, the Khayelitsha Commission of Inquiry was one inquiry that was used to say, look at all the money we spent. But I want to say to this government in the Western Cape, we spent less than 100,000 on this People's Commission of Inquiry. And we learned so much from the voices of the children. The children have come out clear, and we collected about 2,000 testimonies from our children. And our children is not only blaming government, our children is very adamant that every adult in this country must take responsibility for where they are at now, their safety that they are experiencing. So the children's very, very clear that you cannot call us the future leaders and leave us in the mess that we have, because we need to go and fix up the mess that we are in. So our children have articulated very well their position. It is unfortunate in the nomination process and the selection process that children have in a way been sidelined by a very bureaucratic system within Parliament, where we still continue to use processes of the colonial powers, which I feel is one of the challenges that we have. The second thing for me is that, yes, we do have commissioners worldwide. However, there's a big difference between the Children's Commissioner in Canada and the mandate that that person has, compared to South Africa, where child abuse, violation against children is so complex. That, you know, when I done the desktop on different commissioners worldwide, I picked up actually one of the biggest gaps is that our trauma and the level of violence is so continuous and so complex that we cannot follow a European style of child commissioner. And it's unfortunate that a number of issues that civil society had raised and that for us had come from the People's Commission of Inquiry, where we heard the voices of parents, we heard the voices of local government, we heard the voices of civil society, where we could not actually work through some of the issues that we had raised in the oral and written submissions on the bill at that time. And that did not surface in the actual act. So we must acknowledge that, yes, there has been significant progress, but inadequate. We must acknowledge that there are gaps within the legislation, and we must not project the Western Cape Act as the blueprint for the rest of the provinces and on a national level. I think we must be very, very careful on how we're going to proceed forward. The Act is here now. We are now in the process of, we've done the nominations, we now have a selection process that is happening, and I think I would have wanted a far more inclusive process in terms of selection. And it is unfortunate that we held hostage by legislative frameworks and models of doing public participatory and reaching and doing the selection process, because I think it's become a very exclusive process. And don't tell me that I am able to go to a standing committee and ask questions, because that mother who lost a child in Hanover Park, who is struggling, she's dealing with grief, and you wanted to come to a standing committee.
So Valdi, I just want to, because you've brought up the process, I just want to ask Gillion to explain to us a little bit about how the process has run so far from the first, I think it was the nomination of 59 candidates, and those nominations came from the public.
Yeah. So the way the Commissioner for Children's process started was the Speaker of the Provincial Parliament referred the legislation to the Standing Committee on Social Development. The committee then met and agreed to start following and outlining the process as per the legislation for the appointment. And what that legislation required us to do was to publish a call for nominations, which we did. That call for nominations then led to the public submitting 59 nominees for the position of Commissioner for Children for the Western Cape. The committee then published that list of 59 nominations, and this is where a specific public participation process kicked in. Okay. And that public participation process was for members of the public and for civil society organizations to object to any of the nominees.
Can I just ask, and is it specifically for objecting?
Yes.
Not for commenting or offering other sorts of, because
what many people did was when they objected, they gave comment as well.
Okay.
And what the Act makes provision for criteria for disqualification, and also the Act gives guidelines on what type of objection should be taken into account. As you know, with any form of objection, you have to look at whether those objections are subjective or the objective processes. What we also needed to take into account is because the 59 nominees that we have come from a wide variety of skill sets, so objections couldn't be sort of pigeonholed into specific things, for instance. So what the committee then agreed to do is we agreed to look at the objections, and the advice we took was to classify those objections into what is objective and what is subjective. And part of that process also is you have to look at each objection on its own, and you have to look at it in relation to that candidate. And we look at whether those objections fall within the criteria that's been outlined, and some of those objections we've said this is something that we'll have to put to the candidate, for instance.
I'm going to have to interrupt you. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back after this. Welcome back. You're watching The Women's Show, and tonight we're speaking about the new Western Cape Child Commissioner that will be appointed. Gillion, I just want to come back to you to carry on from our conversation earlier. And one of the points was we were looking at the sort of the process to appoint the Child Commissioner. And so there were just two things that you said that I want a little bit more clarification on. There seems to have been, and also throughout the research process will be, a single call for objections. There was when the 59 names were published, but but you're also saying that those 59 names were a bit random. You had to publish all 59 names, whether the nominees wanted to be there or wanted to be on there or didn't. I think you said earlier that some of them also wrote and said they would not like to be a nominee, and you said that you still have to publish it. So the first lot of 59 names was a little bit just whoever's nominated, whether they fit the bill, whether they're disqualified or not, they have to be published. And so it seems that and then from there, you shortlisted, the standing committee shortlisted. And so I'm interested to know, and I think I've said 59 names was quite a lot for people to get through. You've highlighted that you only gave the names, not even what these people do for a living. So the list itself and the notice itself was quite limited in the information that was given to people to be able to object, unless we went out and sort of searched the 59 names itself. Going forward now, there have been 15 names shortlisted. There will be interviews held. I think you said it's between the 18th and the 20th of
17th to the 19th.
The 17th to the 19th of February. Will there be further opportunity for the public to engage with this appointment process? And if yes, what would that look like?
There is no space for engagement because the legislation provided for a public participation process through the objections. And that's happened, and we received quite a long list of objections. And the committee has processed those objections, and those objections have been categorized, etc. So there's no next process for participation.
Okay.
The next process, the process that's happening on between the 17th and the 19th, is where the members of the standing committee is going to be interviewing these candidates. Once those candidates have been interviewed, the standing committee will then make a recommendation to the Premier on appointment. And the Premier will then have 21 days to appoint, or the Premier will come back to the standing committee and the Premier will say, for these reasons, I can't appoint this person, please can you deliberate and find another appointment, etc.
Okay, I see. And would that be a second shortlist that would go to the Premier, or would it be a single person that you...
The Premier gets one person.
Okay.
The standing committee is going to tell the Premier who to appoint.
Okay.
But I think, just from my side, I think what we need to recognize is that the public participation process is flawed.
In general?
Yeah. One, for example, the public were given a list of names of the nominees with no information about these nominees. That means the public had to now go and search for themselves. So you expect children to do that, you expect ordinary members of the public to do that. As a representative from an organization, we struggle to get information from just public information about the nominees. So that process in itself is flawed and is problematic. Like we requested profiles from the chairperson and his committee. At that time, I don't think you had no information was at least at that time to the public. So that process is we need to in terms of going forward, we need to look at that process in itself. The other thing is, for example, with regard, because the Act is at the moment now silent on the next process where we are now, the interview process and then the final selection process. But I think from NGO perspective, the NGOs are meeting tomorrow, day after this discussion, and we're looking at or one of the things that are really coming up is that is there opportunity still to engage with the committee with regard to the criteria for selection, for example. Yes. What is the committee looking at? Like, we're not quite sure what that is. Besides those basic requirements that is there, issues like, for example, are you a good fit? Because the children are telling us that they want to have someone that they can relate to, someone that can talk to them, someone that know all of us. And all of us, they mean the children in the informal settlements, the children who have to navigate violence every day, the children who are fear and who are subjected to sexual violence, and children who are hungry and stuff like that. So that's very interesting. Will the committee, for example, look at what the children are saying, what the children feel, who must represent them? What are the things that society believes that needs to say? Is the committee, well, the committee have to check, do background checks and whether they are, in terms of the child protection register and the police clearance and all that kind of stuff. But are there other levels of check that the committee is also doing? Is there complaints against anybody? Is there inquiries against anybody and all that kind of stuff? And because that, will the committee ask people to declare these things? Will the committee then also make get the researchers to do a scan of those things? Because those things are important. Because we have seen already where people were employed, and then a week later, a year later, then all these things come up.
So
and then doesn't mean then that they are then fit to hold office, right? So those are important things that is coming already. People are discussing in the civil society sector.
If I could maybe respond to just a few of those things, I think it's not fair to say that the Act is silent on the next process. The Act is very clear. Section 2 of the Act states that the committee must consider all objections and all of the nominations and the objections received. It must prepare a shortlist. We've done that. And it says that the committee must invite, every single shortlisted candidate for an interview, which we're doing. So it speaks to the interview process. The Act also outlines what the qualifications for appointment is, and it outlines the criteria. It outlines what this person is supposed to be doing in office. I have to say we've done a lot of the due diligence around the nominees. We've asked security services to do the vetting to make sure that firstly, people comply with the criteria as it's set, that people are not on the child offences register as per the Children's Act, that people do have police clearance and have the right to work with children. And I think whether this person will be able to interact or relate to children, that's going to come out in the interview process. Once you start asking people questions, you're able to then probe, because what information is provided on a piece of paper and submitted is very different to how someone interacts. And I think we also have to be aware of the fact that this is the first commissioner. It's not been done anywhere in the country. We're very grateful that the National Department of Social Development has approached us, and the Office of the Rights of the Child has asked whether they could come and observe the process as well. So we're hoping that there's a larger conversation that's being started from a state perspective in terms of how do we do this at a national level. Because fortunately in the Western Cape, we work with very, very committed NGO partners. And I have to say, the NGO partners have been very involved with the Standing Committee. All of the consultations that Molo Songololo has done, for instance, that's been sent to my office, has gone to the committee. It's tabled in our committee. All of the ideas and recommendations, it feeds into what people are thinking. So the information is not being held and sort of kept from the committee. When we had a workshop, for instance, we looked back and we said, let's take all of the data that's been generated through this public participation process, and we had all of the inputs that were made by the civil society organization. We asked for all of the reports that the Department of the Premier commissioned in the development of the Act, and the committee went through that. So we've taken that information into account. I think on the issue of public participation, the reality is that in South Africa, public participation is flawed. There is a general sense that people cannot participate in all levels of government because the processes are designed in such a way, in such a sort of bureaucratic and officialdom space, that it's not open for people to participate. And I think that's a broader conversation we need to have. But I have to say, with this process, we've tried to be as inclusive as possible where we can. But unfortunately, the onus is on the Standing Committee to make this appointment. And there's no framework in parliamentary procedure for us to invite people to participate in the next part of the process.
And I understand that, and I understand you to be saying also that the process, that the Standing Committee is following the process that's legislated in the Act, and that you didn't create the Act or write those processes. So you guys are sort of, doing what needs to be done to appoint this person. Patrick brought up something, and you did as well, because I wanted to ask whether sort of one of the things I remember when there was a call for a commission of inquiry, I think it was Premier Helen Zille who said that there's enough research has been done, and we can take sort of existing research, and I know there is quite a lot. And you mentioned that those reports were sort of taken into consideration by the Standing Committee and to choose the 15 candidates.
No, the reports that I'm referring to is the legislative work to draft the piece of legislation, the act.
Okay.
I'm not talking about the reports around child murders.
So was there consultation sort of so it was just the Standing Committee sort of going through the backgrounds and going to the CVs to choose those 15, but not in consultation with any
the
other
workshop we had was the Standing Committee developing the criteria. And in that, the Standing Committee used professional expertise in the state, and we used some of the people that worked on the initial draft of the legislation. Just on the issue of the Commission of Inquiry, Ms. Van Reenan would remember that I also chair the Petitions Committee in the Provincial Parliament, and the Trauma Centre submitted a petition. And what came out in that process of the investigation of the Petitions Committee was that there was a collaboration between the Trauma Centre and the Department of Social Development to look into what some of the causes of child murder is. There's a project that's currently running between the South African Police Service, the Provincial Department of Health, the Department of Social Development, as well as the National Prosecuting Authority in collaboration with the Children's Institute at UCT, that's looking at the Children's Death Review, for instance, which is the first of its kind in the country. So there's a lot of work that is being done. What we've also done, and the Premier's focus on safety, has mandated that the Minister of Social Development and the Minister of Education have very specific safety priorities, where the work that the Trauma Centre and DSD has done, that has been included into those provincial safety priorities as well.
Okay, thank you.
I think I just want to comment on that and say that we didn't actually do much work. We had reached an agreement that the department will always be guided by the political heads, and that as an NGO we would have more latitude to interrogate the document further. And so, we agreed to disagree and move on, because at that point the Petitions Committee had asked whether we could have joint hearings. And our view was that if we were going to have joint hearings where Parliament would be giving the money or TST would be giving the money, then we would almost be, our freedom to actually deal with it in a very different, inclusive manner might be curtailed by the political powers that be. So we didn't, as Department of Social Development and ourselves, really work deeper with this. We agreed that we are on the same page in terms of where children are and the risk that they are in, but that's where we left it. And that's what opened the door to the People's Commission of Inquiry. But I want to also say that at the end of the day, I think the Standing Committee has a very, very difficult task, extremely difficult, because one has to balance academic skills, knowledge, expertise against someone who is extremely knowledgeable at grassroots levels at what's happening with children. And it just seems to me that what is seen as more important is the technicalities of the person who will be put in there. What is your expertise? What can you do? Can you research? Can you? And the actual people who have the empathy, who've been dealing with the resilience and dealing with all of those issues, perhaps that is not the center. And I think this is what Patrick was trying to say. So it becomes a position where you're looking for particular skills, which many NGO persons who could have applied did not apply given the criteria. So I think it's very difficult for you now to weigh up the issues of and the experiences that civil society and others have been having with dealing with children with deep trauma and experiencing violence against the technical part of the process. And I have, I have empathy for you.
It's also not just the commissioner. The commissioner is just one person.
Exactly.
And this is a historic process, an historic occasion, and right. But there's also the office of the commissioner, and what is that all about?
So I did actually
will
want
there
to
be
come to
a
that.
staff? What
Exactly.
will be their own function? What will they be doing? If you look at, for example, the Human Rights Commission in some of the other Chapter 9 institutions and some other examples around the world, they have the commissioner, and then they have the people that actually do the work.
Exactly.
Right? They would have researchers, they would have program people, they would have people that promote public participation and all that kind of stuff. The Act, for example, also gives the commissioner particular responsibilities in terms of child participation. How will that happen? You know, and all that. Will the office of the commissioner have the capacity to be able to fulfill all of the functions as set out in the Act? And I think that is also a big discussion. That is also what civil society, NGOs should watch, should get involved in, should participate in that process as well. And I think as much as I understand what the chairperson is saying about the process now, and but the Act also it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't involve the interested stakeholders, the public, for example. There are ways. Some we've had it in the past. If there's political will to do it, then it is there. We know it's a job that they have to do, but public participation is also very important. The public is interested in this. So how do we keep the public informed and involved?
Sorry, Patrick, I just have to stop you right there. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be back after this. Welcome back. Unfortunately, Valdi Van Reenan had to leave, but we are continuing the conversation with Gillion and Patrick. In the last few minutes that we have, Gillion, I just want you to perhaps speak to the public and let us know what we can expect from this new role. I had similar concerns as Patrick in that it seems to be just one person, and we know there are issues within sort of the child protection sector. There are lots of gaps that need to be filled, and I personally cannot see how one person is sort of going to make a difference there. And it might just be, again, as Patrick has said, that we don't understand sort of the roles of commissioners or even commissions. So maybe you could give us a bit more insight into that and why it's important for the public to really follow this process, engage with this process.
I think, I have to say from the start, this has probably been one of the processes where the public has been very involved. And thanks to our social partners, and Molo Songololo has been one of those partners where they've made sure that there's engagement and involvement. And the public has watched this process very closely, and the interactions that they've had with the Standing Committee attest to that. But I think maybe just to recap, the role of the Commissioner is to assist the Western Cape government in protecting and promoting the interests of children in the Western Cape. And that's in particular with regards to health services, education, recreation and amenities, sports, and welfare services. Okay. The Commissioner also has the power, as per the legislation, to monitor, to investigate, to research, to educate, to lobby, to advise, and to report on issues pertaining to children. And just to allay the fears, it's not just an individual. Chapter 4 of the Act states very clearly that there's an administration and the office of the Commissioner. So to adhere to the principle of independence, the Commissioner will be appointed. The Commissioner will then have the authority to set up its office and its operations. And the Commissioner will then decide to what extent does the Commissioner need to focus on its investigative capacity, its educational capacity, and its research capacity. And that's left up to that individual to decide. Because Parliament, we don't want to predetermine what this person has to do. Because the Commissioner will have to come in, the Commissioner will, I think for the first sort of part of his or her role, will start interacting with the different civil society organizations and with the different organs of state to see where they need to start off with. So there's very clear guidelines in terms of what that office can do, and it's up to the commissioner to do that. But the process going forward, we're going to do our best to try and conclude the interview process, and hopefully we'll be able to get a recommendation to the Premier fairly soon. And once the Premier makes an appointment, we're very excited to conclude this process. And I think in my time in government, this has been probably the quickest that we've been able to get something done.
I think I've noted that as well.
Yeah, we started in May and now we're in Feb, and we're very
Yeah.
close to appointing a commissioner. And it has been a very difficult task because you have to do it within the prescripts of the bureaucracy of government.
Okay, Patrick, and perhaps you could just, as a member of the public, let's say, and as a stakeholder, just to say, what would you like to see in a child commissioner? What kind of, in that role, someone doing in that role and being able to focus on, just from your years within the sector and working within child protection and vulnerable children?
Well, I think the first thing is that we still need a lot of education in terms of exactly what is the role and function of a commissioner, this kind of a commissioner for children. Because the commissioner is supposed to be someone who's to monitor, but be a protector of children, be an ombudsperson for children, look after the interests of children, monitor how government is doing to roll out and implement children's rights, for example, and hold government accountable. Now, those are very, very important functions of the commissioner. Then, of course, the commissioner must be independent. And I think this is where Parliament, the provincial Parliament, need to come to the fore and ensure that the commissioner can fulfill its role and function and be independent and hold government accountable. Because the commissioner is assisting the provincial Parliament to fulfill that oversight role, right? And I think that is very, very important.
So can I just ask, Gillion, is that part of the function of the commissioner as set out in the Act? Is there an accountability and oversight?
So the commissioner reports to Parliament, and I think we don't have to worry that the commissioner won't be independent. I think there's nothing threatening the independence of the commissioner.
Yes, but what I'm asking is, will the commissioner be able to have oversight over, as they investigate, over other departments? Because we know there are gaps within DSD, we know there are gaps within the police, as mentioned earlier, in terms of their investigations and the investigations that the commissioner will do. And I think a lot of people are interested in that aspect just because of where we are in the sort of with our high rates of child abuse.
So the commissioner doesn't have oversight over those bodies. Parliament still has oversight.
Okay.
So there's standing committees in Parliament that has oversight. So social development, we have oversight over DSD. Community safety has oversight over the police.
So the commissioner would help the Parliament to provide that oversight.
Okay.
Because Parliament eventually have to release budgets, agree on the budgets, for example, agree on the program, accept the programs or the report, or advise the commissioner, or look at the commissioner. Is the commissioner function within the Act, for example, within its mandate, within its powers? And so in that way, the commissioner is assisting Parliament to provide that oversight. And I think so we need to understand that role of the commissioner as well. Because the commissioner is not just there because it's nice to have.
Yeah.
It's there for a particular role and function. It's part of holding government accountable.
Yeah.
It's part of monitoring government. It's part of monitoring how government is progressing. And then, of course, it's also looking at what is happening in civil society. How's children being treated in their families, in their communities, and all that kind of stuff. So the commission can also engage with civil society to look at remedies, for example, to look at how do we prevent people from violating children's rights, for example. So that is very, very important. And then, of course, the other big issue is that will Parliament ensure that the Commissioner will have enough resources to fulfill its mandate? That is quite crucial. We have seen, for example, with the Human Rights Commission and the Gender Commission, our national parliament have not fulfilled their roles, and therefore they have not got their resources. The South African Human Rights Commission is struggling to survive. Right?
That brings
we don't
us
want
to
that
the
to
end
happen
of our
to this
show,
commissioner.
Unfortunately. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Gillion. That was very helpful. Thank you for joining us. But that's all the time we have. We shall take a short break and be back after this. That's all we have time for this evening. Just to recap, the Western Cape government will be appointing the first Child Commissioner in South Africa. This is an iconic role, and it's important for the welfare and safety of our children. It is the responsibility of all of us to make sure that we follow this process closely. Thank you very much. I'm Lenina Rassool. Good night.